Our first panel is going to explore electoral engagement and campaign strategy. So this is the ecosystem folks are operating in. What do folks do? How do candidates talk to voters? How do organizations talk to voters? How are voters voting? So I'm really excited to welcome this panel. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. You can all come up if you'd like at this moment. Beginning with Maja Harris from Rose City Reform. Maja Harris is the founder of Rose City Reform. She's a journalist and which is a journalism and research project dedicated to tracking Portland's historic reform process. And she's also the host of the Stump Talk podcast, where she interviews elected leaders and political experts about Portland politics. Maja, welcome. Annie, hello. Annie Naranjo-Rivera is a Cuban-American community leader with over 20 years of experience in grassroots organizing, legislative advocacy, and political infrastructure. She's worked from Minneapolis to Oregon across movements for equity, environmental justice, and immigrant rights. She currently serves as the state executive director of the Oregon Working Families Party and state director of Working Families Power, where she's building political power for Oregon's multiracial working class. She lives on Oregon's North Coast with her family and is deeply committed to fighting for economic and political justice statewide. Annie, welcome very much. Andrés, who you all heard from last night, principal and owner of Puede PDX. Andrés, I will not make you listen to me read your bio again. And then from the Data and Democracy Lab, Professor Moon Duchin and Chris Donnay. Professor Moon Duchin is the founder of the Data and Democracy Lab, formerly MGGG, Redistricting Lab, which you heard about, based at Cornell University, where she's a professor of mathematics and public policy, working on research and community partnerships at the intersection of math, modeling, and democratic systems. She's served as an expert witness in redistricting litigation around the country, and the lab has a mission developing civic technology and mathematical tools for promoting civil rights and healthy democracy. And Chris is the lab manager for the Data and Democracy Lab. As a former high school math and computer science teacher, Chris is passionate about pedagogy and science communication. He works on many data analysis projects at the lab and is the principal developer for VoteKit, which is the lab's Python tool and library for simulating ranked choice voting elections. He recently graduated from The Ohio State University with a PhD in mathematics under the advisement of Matthew Call and Moon Duchin. Panel, welcome. I think we're one mic short, so two people might have to share. All right. And I think your team is going first, right? Okay.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. And Norma, are you advancing the slides? So you mind if I just do this? Because there's a lot of, okay, cool. All right, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Moon, and it's a real honor to be here with you tonight. I have been engaged in what's happening here in Portland for years now, and trying to support local organizers. It's been an honor to work with. And watching how this came out and getting to see some of the outcomes is just like completely exciting. Okay, so as you heard, I'm a mathematician who had like a career pivot from like pure theoretical math to democracy. It happened in 2016 because something interesting was going on in national politics. And now we want to take a little bit of time to tell you something about what we see as having happened here in Portland from a kind of math point of view. So let's get those slides queued up if we can. All right, so some things we learned in Portland. All right, so we're just gonna try, and Chris and I are gonna trade off. We're just gonna try to tell you about like 4 biggest lessons that we want you to know. Here's one, we call it know one block. Okay, and so if there's one thing that you remember about this system, STV, where you use ranked choice ballots to elect multiple people out of every district, like, why this system? There's so many other ones you could use. Well, we actually took the results of how people voted here in Portland, and we fed them through a lot of other systems so we could say, with these exact same voter preferences, what would have happened under different systems? How is this one different? Why is it special? I knew it was kind of special. Here in Portland, it was very special, all right? And it had this effect that I think is really important. Oh, here's us, the math nerds. This was the stock photo that came up when I asked Google for math nerds. I didn't say queer math nerds, but it should try. Okay. All right. So it had this one effect. Let's see this next. Great. So what we did was we analyzed if voters liked one candidate, were they likely to also like another? And so that's what you're seeing here in this plot is like green means if I liked you, I probably liked you. And purple means if I ranked you, I was less likely to rank you. You guys understand that? Okay, great. We did this for all the districts. And what we found here, you can see that in District 4, Clark, Zimmerman, and Arnold, they were the top 3 vote getters. They were the top 3 in terms of how often they were mentioned in people's rankings, right? But they were not the 3 winners. And here's a reason, is that actually their supporter, they tended to share supporters. If you liked one, you probably liked the other 2. But even if you take that block and extend it all the way down to lower ranked people that were also liked by the same voters, the full size of that block is 45%. Well, under all those other systems that we were studying, almost all the other systems that we were studying, those would have been the 3 winners. That 45% would have swept the winners in that district. You guys see what I'm saying? That's not what happened under STV. STV doesn't let that happen. If you have a block that is, say, 45%, they have a say, but not all the say. And so what STV does is it makes sure that that next block, which Mitch Green was the top mentioned candidate in the next block, that they share power, that next block gets a voice. And in fact, Green was the next one to cross the threshold after Clark, okay? And so if you remember one thing about STV, that's it. It allows this second block, which had a lot more POC support, a lot more progressive support, to not get shut out. Make sense? Okay.
Awesome. Next slide. So we heard this a little bit from Robin earlier today, but there's this idea that, what if Portland had actually just switched to, say, 12 single member districts instead of 4 multi-member districts? And one of the problems or one of the unique features of Portland as a city is that people are really dispersed here. As we saw in the heat map, people of color live all over the city. And so one of the questions you can ask is, well, how well would people of color have been able to elect candidates of choice under, a single member district system? And what all these box plots show is that, well, actually, it's really, really, really hard to make a majority minority district here in Portland. It's actually even hard to get above like 28% people of color in a single district. And if you increase the percentage in one district, you end up decreasing the percentage in another. So there would really be a trade-off between electing candidates of choice and the ability of the whole city to do that here.
Yeah, and let me just add to that before we go on to the next slide. So that's what happens. That's one of the drawbacks of districts. They can be a really powerful tool for minority groups in the presence of lots of residential segregation. That's why they were such an important tool in the South in the 1960s and like the favorite remedy under the Voting Rights Act. But when you have a lot more dispersal, then it becomes a kind of zero-sum game. Or if you try to create a district that's especially strong for a minority group, you're leeching power from the districts around it. Does that make sense? Okay, and this system didn't require these concentrated majorities in order to be effective. So that's the second thing to know about the system we got. Next, please. Okay, so sure, let's just put them all up. All right, so as you heard, I've done a bunch of expert work in voting rights cases around the country. In fact, in particular, that Alabama case that you might have heard a lot about. So I'm the NAACP LDF's mapper in that case. So like drawing that district that ended up electing Shomari Figures out of Alabama's District 2 is a very proud accomplishment of the last few years. And having Clarence Thomas write so much about me in his dissent, that's another. Okay. Look, a slightly unexpected career turn for a theoretical mathematician. Okay, but having said that, the work that you do as part of a voting rights case is you try to figure out, even though we have a secret ballot, you use statistical inference techniques to try to figure out how different groups voted. It's a core important part of a voting rights case. And so we did that all over Portland. And we learned a lot of things. Oh yeah, it looks like the slides got a little garbled in the transmission, but hopefully you'll be able to see most of these points. What we learned is, first, we built new methods here in Portland. I think this is the first time that we've adapted these methods to ranked choice voting. So we're always trying to push the kind of math and data science envelope just a little bit. And if you could put up the next couple pictures as well, I'll just explain broadly what you're gonna see. So the way you do this really, really briefly is you look at the different precincts and you ask, did the precinct with more black voters tend to support this candidate? Then you can infer that black voters prefer this candidate. That's the basic idea. And so that's what these plots show with the lines going up and down. And so the one up top shows you that, again, in District 4, an interesting thing happened. So Clark, who overwhelmingly got the most votes, is distinct. See that line sloping down? Less popular with voters of color than with white voters. Whereas Green, a white candidate who was elected in that district, is a candidate of choice for voters of color. So even though all the candidates who got a lot of rankings in District 4, all the candidates were all white, that doesn't mean that people of color didn't get a voice, right? This concept of candidates of choice is really fundamentally important to thinking about the efficacy of the system. The other pictures show you other kind of elements of this. One, and I think Tiffany Kayama-Lane is here. Later today. All right, we'll be here. So actually something that was really interesting about her patterns of support, she's popular with Asian voters. She ran as an Asian identified candidate, but she's even more popular with Latino voters, right? And so things like that you can tease out when you're looking at these patterns that might not have been evident at a first glance. Another learning here, I won't go into this in like super granular detail, but another learning, if you look at Loretta Smith and Candace Avalos, if you look at their patterns of support in District 1, you see something kind of interesting. Smith's support is strongest where the black population is highest. It's a classic pattern that shows that Smith was a black candidate of choice. But Avalos' support is really distributed around the district, and in fact follows more of a neighborhood pattern than a racial and ethnic pattern, which we thought was really interesting. Okay, so this kind of analysis lets us tease out how people's strategies for campaigning together were and were not effective, and it lets us be sure all 5 winners who are POC identified, who are people of color, were also POC preferred, as well as one of the white winners.
These numbers have been up on the screen a couple times, but we think they're really awesome, and I really want to highlight them again. There's this popular narrative in the press that there's error rates abound, and this is going to really hamper people's ability to be expressive with their ballots and really get their voice heard if their ballot gets kind of tossed out in some kind of error incident. But in fact, if you look at all of these different ways of slicing how ballots were tabulated and where they ended up in the tabulation, you get these pretty fantastic numbers. I'll highlight the utility rate, how many voters ranked a winner. This is upwards of 80% in all these districts. So 80% of voters in a district had at least one candidate that they ranked on their ballot that is now on the city council. And that's an incredibly high number for representation for voters. And then on the flip side, you have this incredibly low futility rate, around 1% in each district. How many voters ranked a full ballot, but their ballot was inactive before the last round? Only 1% or so of voters had that happen to them. So 99% of voters, or 99% of voters who ranked a full ballot, had that ballot count in some meaningful way throughout the entire process. So I think this speaks to the voter education that went on here in Portland. People are ranking full ballots. As you can see from this fun little bar chart, the most commonly ranked ballot was a ballot of length 6, ranking all your candidates. And this is actually different than what we see in other localities. For example, in Scotland, people are more likely to rank just the number of candidates that the number of seats there are. So here in Portland, that's 3 seats, but you see, overwhelmingly people voted for 6 candidates instead of those 3.
Yeah, I want to kind of echo that. I've never seen this pattern before, and it's really a testament to you all who are doing the work of telling people, of getting people comfortable with the system and encouraging them to use their full voice. I've never seen the pattern where the most common kind of ballot is a complete ballot. And look how strong that is here in every single district in the city. So that's a real triumph. And yeah, I'm sorry these slides, some sort of software glitch. We'll make sure that the slides that aren't quite so garbled get distributed. But I think the narrative that says that error rates were particularly high in communities of color is really missing the forest for the trees here, right? This astonishing outcome of efficacy, of utility, of people getting those candidates of choice into office really dominates these kinds of difference between a 1% and a 2% error rate. And it's simply the wrong focus when you have so much overwhelming evidence of efficacy. Okay, so that's pretty much it for us. We'll just say we're a data science team that loves to work with community groups. And it's really wonderful to be here with so many of you. We hope you'll reach out to us. And if you want to learn to do this kind of analysis. We have a training coming up in lovely Ithaca, New York in June, and I hope you'll reach out to us about coming or sending someone from your group to learn to do this kind of work. Thank you.
I can go next if we can get my slides queued up. Just kidding, Maya's going next.
Okay. I'm so high up. I feel like I'm weirdly self-conscious about being so high up. So I will be a little more general because I see a lot of faces that I'm not familiar with, and so I'll try to be kind of a little bit general about the vibe of this election. I'm a researcher, and I spent a lot of time talking to candidates about how they ran and how they thought of this election. I have a slide up there that shows a little bit about the sort of extraordinary outcome of this election. I can't quite see it, so forgive me if I'm not talking in order, but we researched both the candidate pool and the elected body. And we found that the candidate pool was fairly aligned with the general population, and in most places except for gender, where women were quite underrepresented. But then we saw a very interesting thing happen in the election, which was that representation for all previously or recently underrepresented groups increased in this election. So we see 27% of the candidate pool being women and 50% of women winning seats, so achieving gender parity there. Yeah, worth an applause for sure. And we also see candidates who identify as BIPOC representing a portion of the candidate pool that's pretty closely aligned with the general population, but then we see 42% of seats going to candidates who identify as BIPOC. We also see that in the candidate pool, about 18% of candidates identify as members of the LGBTQ community, and then we see that rise to about a third of the council. Then there's another interesting thing that happens with age, which is that millennials just completely crush this election. And this may look, I see Robin smiling. Yeah. And I think this is kind of interesting because you might look at this and say like, well, now they're overrepresented on council, right? But it's important to remember that no millennial had served on council and no member of Gen Z, and we have one member who is right in the generational sort of divide. So we almost have a Gen Zer on the council, and I think when I look at that, what I see is an electorate that's kind of saying, it's time for change. We're coming out of really low approval ratings for city council. We're coming out of strong incumbent sentiment in the elections leading up to this, and we kind of see, I think, a lot of voters just saying, let's go. It's time for this generation to step into leadership. So those are some of the things I see when I look at this. Something else that I see that I think is interesting is that the candidates that win, right? There's no recipe for success. Like, this was a very competitive election, and we'll have both people who won and people who didn't win, and a lot of them did everything right. Like they were good at fundraising, they qualified for public financing, they formed alliances, they got the heavy hitter endorsements, right? But then when we look at who won, it's not as simple as saying, like, you were on the labor slate, so you won. In fact, when we look at, we measured all endorsements, and when you look at a lot of endorsement categories, whether it's endorsed by elected officials or endorsed by environmental group or business, in the top 10, half win and half lose. And the ones who win are not always the top 10 in each category. And to me, that says, and I'm not alone in this, is that it's the candidates that manage to connect with district voters. Like, they are the ones that come out on top in this election. And I think we see when you don't have to appeal to a citywide audience anymore, and you don't even have to appeal to the entire district, right? You can focus in on your base. You start to see candidates kind of being free to be who they are, right? We see a lot of authenticity. We see people kind of coming out and saying things like that we wouldn't have heard, like, I'm a socialist, or, I'm a person of faith. Like, we see some of these things that we're not used to hearing in elections, and people really leaning into that. And I think we see the electorate respond and kind of say, okay, I see myself in this candidate. And I think that's kind of my takeaway early on from what happened in this election, and sort of why we saw the results that we did. So I'll pass it on. Or do you want to share this?
Who's next in the slide deck?
Or maybe it was you.
I think it's you. Oh, okay.
Looks like it's me. Hi all, Andrés also, he, they, el pronouns, Organ Futures Lab for today. I'm here to talk a little bit about the Portland Voter Guide. I gave folks a little bit of a preview yesterday. So this was the BIPOC-led effort to educate voters on a slate of unity candidates. But backing up, the slides start with the history of this, which for folks who were here yesterday will be familiar. Back from the Charter Commission being seeded in 2020 to Portland United for Change being a BIPOC-led ballot effort to pass that in 22. To the BIPOC plus table that eventually led to the voter guide convening the next year, which paired with a completely separate voter education effort that culminated in the November election. So it can be helpful for folks to both see the timeline of this, but also the arc of continual community organizing to create a better system, to pass that system, and then to elect candidates who represent the values of that system. So there has been a very long community investment in this work. Next slide. Here's some of the organizations who were part of that effort. So you'll see a lot of culturally specific organizations, a lot of groups that have a specific base and region that they work with. All of them were active in some role, with some organizations having the bandwidth to have a larger role in the efforts. And so the main thing on the next slide that I'm going to be talking about today is the independent expenditure effort that happened to promote that slate. It was an independent expenditure because of restrictions from the public financing system that allowed candidates to run, which also meant that most efforts to boost a number of them with external resources had to come through an independent expenditure. And Annie's going to be talking a little bit about what a coordinated effort with candidates would look like. So in the next slide, you'll see the scope of the mail program. So it reached just over 200,000 households, which was over 300,000 voters, 2 drops, an early drop and a late drop, which matched the database that we had on when folks were voting, so reaching voters at a time that made sense for them. It did focus on all 4 districts, and on the next slide, you'll see a sample of that mail piece. It included both information about voting to make sure folks had clarity on what to do, highlighted a slate of candidates that included the mayor, city council, and relevant county districts. On the next slide, you'll see what that looked like for the other districts, so a similar creative, but swapping in the candidates for each district that had been landed on by that slate. And then on the final slide, you'll see a little peek of the digital voter guide, which also contained all of the information on the website for folks. On the next slide, you'll see some of the field numbers. So it was led by 4 organizations, Next Up Action Fund, Latino Network Action Fund, East County Rising, and Color Pack and OFL playing a facilitation role. So you'll see the number of attempts, the door knocks. This was really a targeted effort to figure out what organizations had relationships in specific communities, where were voters that needed to be reached, and how could we use that as an effort to both talk about a slate of candidates, but also do some of this election is going to be a little bit different. Your ballot's going to look like this. You have to think about all of these races, all of your rankings. So the script did include general education, recognizing that as a first-time election, there was a need to reach voters with information as well as updates on specific candidates. Oh, sorry, next slide. And great. So after the election, we did polling using a polling firm to understand some of the voting trends. It's going to complement a lot of the research that you've heard already today. So on the next slide, I talked about this yesterday, but it shows you kind of the turnout and showing that while there was a lot of coverage that there had been less of voter turnout in the local elections that matched decreases across the state and across other counties. So that was something that we had to struggle with this time because there was so much scrutiny on the changes that there was then this narrative that as people took a hyper close look at the election results, that was the fault of the changes that had been made. And so there was a lot of post-election work that we had to do to try to respond to those concerns and try to correct the record after the fact once the narratives have started. On the next slide, I think Becca covered these slides already, so I'll go through them quick. Again, just showing that 9 in 10 voters felt confident filling out their ballot. And then on the next slide, showing that voters overwhelmingly felt that the system was preferable to the previous system, both electing mayor in ranked choice voting and electing council with 3 councilors per district. On the next slide, this is something that Moon talked about just a second ago, but showing how overwhelmingly folks used the rankings, right? Having 41% use all 6, and most people, 84%, rank at least 3. But then on the next slide, we actually were able to break that out by district as well as race and ethnicity. And so if you look at that, you will see that, again, overwhelmingly across all groups, folks are using most of the rankings. And while there are variations by district and there is a disparity between white voters and voters of color, it was not disproportional. It was not out of control. And in fact, for us, makes the case for why there continues to be a need for voter education. There continues to be a need to especially reach District 1, which I think folks have been hearing about a lot this district. It is the district that has had the least representation. It is a district that has more diversity, lower incomes, more kids. And I think as we were out on the doors, what folks heard is that folks don't understand why local government matters. They don't see this as something that affects their lives, something that is important to the outcome being important to their day-to-day experience. And so the case that needs to be made is to show them that representation does something, that having local electeds who represent them will lead to a different outcome for them. And that's the problem we're trying to solve, right? It is much bigger than they didn't know how to fill out their ballot. It is a belief in the value of their vote when it comes to local election. And so that's what we're seeing in these disparities. Last little poll insight. In our poll, we tested political orientation or identification, and we saw that progressives used all 6 rankings the most. So obviously, all voters had the same information, all voters had the ability to rank candidates, and we did see a tiering of who used the most number of rankings by political identification. And then last slide, everyone's been talking about this, and I'm just going to keep highlighting it because it is so groundbreaking of seeing the fact that when you look at these districts, East Portland has the lowest, but even then, 80% of voters ranked someone who won. So that level of enfranchisement, that level of representing people is something you don't see in other voting systems, right? And it's by design. This is something that we continue and will expect to see in future elections because, like Moon mentioned, it doesn't empower a bloc to sweep, but rather elects the candidates who have the broadest amount of support. And so that ability to really represent voter choice and for folks to, like Maya was saying, really connect with the voters in their district, have a base and speak for a community is something we're already seeing happening in this new system.
Thanks, Andres. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause for that, for sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Naranjo-Rivera, and I am the state director of the Oregon Working Families Party. I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about what WFP is, and then I think it'll become clear why we got involved in the Portland City Council races. We're fighting for a better Portland for the people. Next slide. And our North, I think we're missing a slide. Our North Star is to build a multiracial, feminist, working people's party of the American left that wins governing power to enact a structural reform agenda to save the planet and all the people on it. But what that really means is we actually have to deliver meaningful policy that impacts working people. So tagging on to what Andres just said, you know, we can educate people, we can get the votes, we can look at these impressive results, but at the end of the day, now that these folks are elected, we have to deliver something and translate that back to the voters and the folks that we talk to on the doors and make sure that they understand, you know, what these changes really mean to them in real life. So the 5 building blocks of WFP Power are to grow a mass base of voters, recruit and develop leaders with training and political education, align individual activists, leaders, and organizations representing millions of working people, and continuously develop top-notch electoral organizing skills, build independent electoral infrastructure, and then exercise ideological power. So articulate a bold vision and help voters make meaning of candidates and electoral systems. This completely overlays with what happened in the Portland races. So starting at the beginning, building that mass base of voters, doing voter education, recruiting and developing leaders and candidates, right? So we've got this brand new system. It's so exciting. Everything had to line up perfectly. We've heard the historical timeline starting last night in the presentations about how we got this new system in place. But now, we have to have the overlay of small donor elections to make that accessible so working people can actually run. We have to teach people how to do compliance. We have to teach them the bare bones of how to campaign. And you're not born knowing how to run for office. Well, raise your hand if you're born knowing how to run for office. Okay, so we get from this incredible potential with structural reform to where the rubber meets the road, which is we've got to take our folks and get them battle ready to make it through this election cycle. There were some really incredible things that we saw in terms of differences between the way that candidates interacted with each other in these races and what we would typically see, which is more adversarial and negative campaigning and things like that. So we saw a lot more collaboration, resource sharing, data sharing even, joint field operations, things that are like pretty incredible. Next slide. So in short, we have to build our own power. We have to win every single political office that we can. So that's our goal. We started here, next slide, we had 13 candidates that made it through 2 rounds of endorsements. And you can see our win and loss right here. So in the mayor's race, that was a loss. We had Candace Tamor, Steph Routh, and Jamie Dunphy in District 1. It's noteworthy that we rolled out the endorsements in 2 different rounds, and I think that impacts some of the results. So when we first did our endorsement process, we wanted to make sure that we got folks that were viable early on, who had been doing the work, getting their name out there, doing the fundraising. So we had a threshold. People had to have met the 250 small donor threshold to be eligible for Working Families Party endorsement. And that shows that they're doing the work, they've got a base of support, and we use that as a viability threshold. So some people hadn't met that, and we heard a lot of feedback from folks in our communities, our members, that essentially they wanted a second round of endorsements. Like people were filing nonstop. You heard there were over 100 people filed. But B, especially for some of our folks who aren't used to running for office, or who weren't raised in a political family and this is brand new to them, they might not know how to navigate the process of seeking an endorsement or getting themselves filed really early on and all of these things. So we really wanted to make sure that we were catching a really representative group of folks while still making sure that they were viable. In the 2nd district, we had, well, you can see the things, I won't read them all, but we had 7 out of the 12 current counselors who were WFP candidates. We worked very heavily with them. What I kind of want everyone in the room to leave with is, so this is the IE side, there's a firewall between Andres and I, so we can't talk to each other, so we don't know what they're doing while the cycle is going on. And I was on the coordinated side. So myself and my statewide field director, Thomas Rogers, were essentially 2 of the only people left on the coordinated side. So when you're planning for your states, don't do that. So that's a lesson that we learned. What's incredible is that those dominoes did line up. And so this huge mail program that you just read about, that perfectly filled the need that our candidates had on the coordinated side. They were fundraising, getting out the word, educating people, trying to get mailers out. But at the end of the day, a lot of them, you know, in their plans had to cut things because there's only so much money to go around. And one of the things that a lot of them happened to cut was their mail. So they'd say, oh, I only have enough money to put out 1 mailer. We know that the data shows that you need a certain saturation for the message to sink in. So, you know, when we're advising our candidates, and helping them and coaching them, we're like, well, you know, sending out 1 mailer, you almost bet you might as well not send out a mailer. I mean, it depends on the race and the circumstances, but then we see this incredible across the firewall thing happening, which is this huge slate of mail. So everything really did perfectly coalesce in Portland to get what we've got. But now that we know and have had a firewalls down debrief, we can really plan for a more robust support of our folks. Okay, so these are the folks. In District 1 and District 3, the coordinated field effort was really a model that should be followed. So they were launching events together. They were data sharing. Our community orgs, Working Families Party is made up of BIPOC-led C4s and labor allies and progressive orgs. So we're a pretty robust coalition. So we've got folks, you know, in all of these communities who are doing the work. Some of them were doing the education work to bring everyone up to speed on the new ranked choice voting system. And all of those folks coming together to launch canvases, to put out information digitally, to host community events and forums. That is kind of the beauty of what we saw come together in District 1 and 3. I would say that the districts where there was, for our endorsed candidates, where we saw people kind of working more independently were 2 and 4, and with varying results. So from a WFP point of view, we only had 1 of our candidates make it through in District 4, Mitch Green, and Samir and Alana both in District 2. When it comes to who we endorsed, our endorsement criteria, I think, is on the next slide. So people had to have met the 250 donor threshold, fill out a questionnaire, submit a 3-minute video, and then they would receive a vote of our membership. And that's all of our members, and we wanted to make it an inclusive process. They actually used ranked choice ballots to vote on who they wanted to endorse. And then our state committee would ultimately decide on that. So next slide. We had to think about if they're going to be effective in moving our issue agenda and advocating for their communities. So representation alone isn't the criteria that we're using. We want to also make sure that they're viable, and then think about like how valuable they're going to be to affiliates and constituencies that they represent. In 2017, I ran a state Senate campaign in East Portland, which is the district you all have heard about. And in that district, we were talking to people who had never had their door knocked on. This is deep East Portland. We had canvassers coming in from the more cushy, progressive areas of Portland, and they were like, we didn't know the roads were like this out here. Potholes big enough that a car can fall into them, and had just not been east of 82nd ever in their life. We were doing outreach that was multilingual in 12 different languages. At the time, that was like unheard of. And still now, the political establishment in Oregon will tell candidates that it is a waste of resources to print in English and Spanish materials. Now, we know that that's not true, and we know that all of our communities do deserve representation. But to be able to be part of knocking doors and seeing what it looked like, we were collaborating with then Joanne Hardesty's city council campaign to knock those East Portland doors, and she lived the furthest east of anyone that had ever been on the city council. To see the transformation from that to candidates working together, actually having guaranteed representation in District 1, it's absolutely incredible. We did hold a lot of the weight of supporting these folks and training them up. I want to show really quickly the next slide. I'm going to breeze through this because we're running out of time, but a lot of these people are first-time campaigners, so building strong relationships with folks. We are professionals, and we do this with a lot of people, and we bring people along wherever they're at. We meet them there, but you have to build trust, and so that trust building, if you're running people's lives while they're in office, everything they do is scrutinized. They're under extreme stress. They're crying, their feet are tired, they want to have a day with their family, all those things. So we're in the trenches with them. So while we're providing them with like institutional support and campaign services and things like that, we're also providing moral support. And that's what it takes to go from implementing this new system to actually having these folks elected. So we got the system, now we have to do this next step. Next slide. Okay, so campaign services, there's a lot here. We'll share these slides out after, but essentially, like thinking about what it's gonna take to get your people through in a cohesive way, and as much as we can strategize about that together before the firewalls are here, we can talk about like what is it gonna take, and what does that look like to build the pipeline of leaders, and not just the candidates, because if we have 50 incredible BIPOC candidates ready to go right now, they're progressive, they're good on the issues, we do not have the campaign staff to support those people. So they will not get elected. So we must build a pipeline of campaign staff and leaders to do this work, the campaign services, and hold those people to get them into office. And then once they're there, we have to defend their seats. So there's that. Next slide. So this is the fundraising side by side of some of our folks. And I think that it's interesting to look at how they were doing with that. Fundraising is a big lift for candidates, especially folks who maybe didn't grow up with generational wealth passed down to them. So now they're asking strangers for money, and they're doing it for a good reason, but we have to, again, bring them along and help people Rolodex and build lists and support their call time. And then with the small donor program, there's some pretty strict limitations around that. So luckily the IEs were also doing incredible things. So we have a system in Oregon where we can look up campaign finance activity, and close to the election, we're in 7-day reporting. So we're like looking at the system. We're like, what is the IE doing? And that's the extent of the information that we have, right? And they don't know what we're doing either. So they're just trusting that we're supporting these folks. Next slide. Okay, so overall, campaign planning and management went well, training, mentorship, field skill development and strategy. We had really high GOTV rates for IDing voters. Essentially, when we're identifying voters, we do persuasion early on, and then we follow up with them to make sure that those folks that we identified as supporters or leading support actually turn in their ballots. Campaign services, navigating small donor elections, and coordination in D1 and D3, which I mentioned. Next slide. What needs improvement? I think there might be press in the room, so I'm gonna breeze through this, but essentially, we got a late start for our round 2 candidates and the mayor's race. The mayor's race, also, most of their staff went to the IE side, so in the Carbon Rubio mayor's race, obviously there were a lot of factors there, and press coverage included. But getting that late start, I think, did hurt some of our candidates. We were under capacity on coordinated and couldn't support in all the ways we wanted to. One of the things was the new compliance rules. So having a new system, small donor elections, and just the normal challenges of navigating compliance is also something to think about with brand new working class candidates, some of whom don't have the institutional knowledge of how these systems work. Candidate fundraising, volunteer organizing. So there were so many candidates that there's a limited volunteer pool. Right now, if you could see a dot for every person in Portland that wants to volunteer on a campaign, there's a finite amount of people. And so when you've got candidates all over the city running, there's only so much resource of volunteer time to go around. And then coordination between D2 and D4, which I mentioned. I think that is perfect. So there's lessons learned here. And slate ranking is the only other thing that I think we really haven't touched on, which is we didn't know. We did research and talk to other cities that already have ranked choice voting and other localities, but we didn't know 100%. We know what it looks like to win a race, to endorse in a race and win in a race when it's our candidate versus the other person. But we didn't exactly know how the endorsement strategy was going to play out, so we did some experimentation. And I think it's worth noting that in some of our districts, we had not all candidates that are the most radical, flaming progressives, totally in alignment with WFP 1000%. So there was some diversity in who the slates contained, and that also translated into, I think, some of the victories. So, yeah. That's it. Okay.
Yeah, we have time for just a couple questions. Robin's going to help with the mics. You can share your wired mics. Does anyone have questions? Let's see how many there are real quick. Three. We can do 3 questions. So keep your hands up so we can make a quick stack. Great. Okay. Robin to Michelle, and then Neelu, you'll be next, and then we'll do the third, and then we'll take a break. So who was first? Sorry, did I miss it? Okay.
Hi, mine is really quick. I'm Beatrice Bobrin with North Carolina for the People. On your first slide for who you choose to endorse, you said 250 donors, excuse me. Is there a minimum for how much each person needs to donate in order for that to be qualified?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the City of Portland's public financing program, and so donations were allowed for $5 to $50, and they were matched, so it's building on the infrastructure the city already had. So any $5 donation counts for that financing, and you need 250 donors in the City of Portland to then receive the first tier of matching.
Okay, hi, Neelu Jenks with Fair Vote Washington. Thank you so much for the panel, and thank you, MED, for organizing this event. I kind of have 2 questions. One was around, you said progressives use their ballots more fully. I'm wondering if they had more choices, and or did progressive organizations do better organizing and education? And then, quick follow-up, on council now, I know we haven't had a lot of opportunity to see the governing. How are they working together, the candidates that got there? Are we seeing less, we saw less negative campaigning, you'd said. How's that translating when they're in office?
Yeah, so I can give an initial answer, and then maybe folks will want to follow up. I think the political trends in Portland match most large cities, right? I think there are more progressive candidates who ran, so maybe there were more choices. There definitely were a variety of candidates endorsed by businesses, by real estate, by the police union. So there definitely were candidates of other varieties. So it isn't just that there weren't other options. Sorry, can you remind me of the rest of your question? The next.
Well, can I jump in on that first part? So one of the things that I was nervous about, that maybe we in the lab were nervous about, is just, you heard earlier about the low barriers to becoming a candidate, and so there were so many candidates. So districts 3 and 4 had 30 named candidates each, plus the options to write in, and somewhat fewer in districts 1 and 2. But so it's not the case that only progressives saw 6 people they could rank, first of all. But also, just that context of the sheer number of candidates is what made us want to measure this futility rate, because it makes you worry that people can rank a full ballot and still not touch the ones who end up in contention. And so that's also the context for why it was so encouraging that that futility rate remained so low.
The answer to your second question is that they are doing a phenomenal job. So the council president is a WFP endorsed candidate, and the council vice president, who you'll hear from, teacher Tiffany Kiyama-Lane, will be on the panel later. So with that leadership, really collaborative leadership, and then folks bringing forward the needs of community and being well received with the progressive governing majority. The first 100-day report back is absolutely incredible. They've done things like put forward a study of how we can implement social housing in Portland, stop the Zenith situation in its tracks, and there's plenty of victories that are already emerging. Algorithmic price fixing for rent is, something that's being considered. Funding Portland's street response alternative to just having a police response to a crisis. That's the kind of stuff that we couldn't have dreamed about a couple of years ago and is now reality in Portland. So, and you all can do it where you are too. So.
Yes, and then to that organizing point, I think what you're seeing is it wasn't one thing, it was everything, right? It was charter changes changing the districts and the number of people and ranked choice voting. It was public financing, allowing people to run and receive matching funds. It was a unprecedented investment in voter education to teach people about the changes, to see people using their options more than were in other places. It was the Working Families Party rebooting their state program and investing deeply on the coordinated side, and an unprecedented investment in the IE slate that led to then what Maja and Moon are seeing in the results. Right, so it wasn't one piece, it really took the full collaboration and all of it coming together.
Sorry, I'm going to pull this over you. Try not to. I think one thing that's become kind of clear as we watch the new government sort of organize themselves is that we couldn't anticipate all of the issues that would arise when we placed a completely new framework on an existing system. So one of the things we're working on here in Portland now is how to figure out how to combine this new government that largely works through coalitions of office holders with different priorities, sort of caucusing, right? How we combine those with our very strict public meetings laws. We have a very strict public meetings law that prohibits things like serial conversations where you're kind of talking to somebody about like we might support this, and how do you think this person feels? But a lot of that is not allowed, or at least that's the current interpretation. So how you figure out how to advance a policy agenda under these rules is something we're figuring out, and it has pros and cons. Like we're getting to see in Portland, office holders like to refer to this as sausage making in public. Like you get to see it all. You get to see kind of all the sort of stops and starts, and like, I didn't realize I couldn't like share this with you, or but it's not always the most effective and efficient system. So I think it all comes from a good place, but it's something we're working out.
On that, I just want to say the next step on the trajectory is governance training. So I know that a number of our WFP endorsed candidates did the local progress training, governance training, which was put on by OFL right immediately after they were elected. So it was like, you won, okay, quick, come into this room. But that has to be ongoing. And so in the same way that we have to build the infrastructure for getting the folks elected, we also have to build the infrastructure to receive these new, sometimes untrained or from different experiences of life candidates as they turn into our elected officials and leaders.
So my question is for Moon and Chris on the you talked about the disbursement of populations across the city. Is that unique to Portland, or do you think other RCV cities have kind of similar demographics, or other cities, like how we can kind of interpret and use that as we're have to create districts if we're looking at that, or other reforms with that we're trying to implement? So
That's a great question. I really appreciate the question. We've now done, I think it's 33 and counting, local studies to look at different systems in the conditions that people actually vote in, under the choices they're thinking about for their democracy reform. And it's not always the case that districts can't work. And I'll give you just one example off the top of my head. In Cincinnati, we found that based on the extreme patterns of residential segregation, districts could be very effective for Black enfranchisement. In other words, you could get not only to proportionality, but actually past it with districts. In I think 32 out of 33 places, we found that STV would be more effective. But it's for us, I just want to emphasize, this is one reason to like put some academics in the mix. Like for us, it's a question. It's not an advocacy position that we take for granted. It's a question that we want to bring the data to and model. STV has a remarkable winning streak in the modeling is what I'll point out. But there are many other systems that could be situationally appropriate, that could be better aligned with people's needs on the ground. And I think that's really important, not to push for like one size fits all system change. Do you want to add anything?
I think the only thing I want to add is that it also reminds me that like so many of the successes in Portland come from demographics other than race. We're excited that there's renters, that there's millennials, that there's people of faith. And so when you think about districts and patterns of residential segregation, not all of those groups are going to fall into those patterns as well. So STV can really come in handy for things other than that.
And so I really want to emphasize Moon's point of it. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, right? The effort was not started with a presupposed, like, communities of color had gotten together and said this abstract form of government is what we want. It was a, what are we trying to accomplish? And then going through a rigorous process, bringing in experts to figure out what are the different options, how would they play out, and for a place, for its geography, for its residential patterns, what is the system that best represents and creates that for people?